Welcome to your grammar video for week 7. And we're going to start on adjective clauses, which compared to the other grammar we have done this term, it's a little more advanced. And you're going to need to kind of take all your grammar knowledge that you learned from your grammar review, the tenses review, and you are going to have to use it all together for learning about adjective clauses. Now, in my opinion, I don't think we should teach adjective clauses until level 8 when you do more like sentence structure education, but I do not make the rules. Okay, so I have a notebook. You should have a notebook too. I have some ice cold coffee that I am still drinking. And yeah, so let's go on a adjective clauses adventure. So in my experience, the best way to learn adjective clauses is kind of slowly, step by step. So we're going to start with what is, I think, a pretty easy question, which is, what is an adjective? I hope to God you know the answer to this question. So adjectives in the English language are generally words that describe a noun. So if we have a noun like table, so table is a noun, adjectives are the words we use to describe the table. So is the table like wooden? Is the table pink? These words are adjectives because they are qualifying the noun. So we have to remember this relationship between adjectives and nouns. Adjectives give us extra information about the noun. So if I am in a furniture store and there are 30 different tables and I say, I like that table, your friend will be like, which table? There are 30 tables. And you're like, oh, I like the pink table. And then, so the adjective helps separate the noun from a group of similar nouns. So it's adding extra qualifying information about the noun. Okay, so now we know what an adjective is. The next question is a little more difficult. The next question is, what is a clause? Now, some of you may know the answer. It depends on your education that you had in your own country. But it's a little more difficult than what is an adjective. Okay, so what is a clause? A clause is basically a piece of language. So it does not have to be a full sentence. So many people get a sentence, a phrase, and a clause mixed up. But they are all not the same thing. A clause is not the same thing as a sentence. A clause is a piece of language. Now, sometimes a clause can be a sentence. They can be the same thing, but they are not always the same thing. So, the only rule for a clause is that it's a piece of language and it must contain a subject, number 1, and number 2, a main verb. Okay, a subject and a main verb. So it is any piece of the English language that contains a subject and a main verb. Now, a sentence can, ignore this, I'm just going to give some examples down here. So I can say something like, I like cats. And this is a complete idea. It's a complete sentence. It has a subject and a main verb. So this is an example of a clause. also say something like, because I like cats. Because I like cats is not a full sentence. But it is a clause because it has a subject and a main verb. So clauses are any complete piece of language that contains a subject and a main verb, but does not have to be a complete sentence. Okay. So there are two different styles of clauses. We have, what am I pointing at? We have independent clauses and we have dependent clauses. Now, before we just talk about what this means in grammar, I would like to talk about what the words or the adjectives independent and dependent mean when we are talking about people. I think it's easier to understand. So, if you are an independent person, what this usually means is that you do not rely on other people for help. You do things by yourself. So for example, I am a very independent person. I am not married. I live by myself with my daughter. I make my own money. I do my own work. And so I consider myself to be a very independent person. I've also traveled a lot by myself, and I'm very comfortable being alone. I don't need other people for many things. I like other people, but I don't need other people. So I am a very independent person. Now, some people are quite dependent. Now, this is not negative or positive. It's just different situations. So being dependent is the opposite of independent. If you are dependent, it means you rely or you need other people for different things. Now, some of you sweet level 7 babies are teenagers or you're quite young, and probably your parents are still paying for things like paying for your schooling or paying your rent or giving you money every month to live. Even though you might live by yourself, you're quite dependent on your parents for financial help, money help. Some of you might be married, and if you are married, usually married people are dependent on each other. So one person cooks and takes care of the children, and this person needs them to do that. And maybe this person makes more money and this person needs you to do that. So you are dependent on each other. Most people are dependent on someone for something. So my question to you is, do you think that you are an independent person or a dependent person, and why? You could ask each other this on WhatsApp if you want. It's kind of a cute question. Some people get embarrassed by this question, but I think it's kind of nice. I mean, some people consider themselves to be an independent spirit, like their soul is independent, but maybe they are dependent on their wife to make money. Like, we don't know. Okay. Oh, it's cold. Cold coffee. Not in a good way, in a bad way. Okay. Now, what does independent and dependent mean for clauses? Okay, so if an independent person is someone who does not need other people, an independent clause is a piece of language that does not need any more pieces of language to have meaning. So for example, I like cats is an example of an independent clause. This has complete meaning alone. This has complete meaning alone. So we can add extra information to it. Like we can say, I like cats and I like dogs. But the piece of information, I like cats, is a complete unit of meaning by itself. So if your clause has a complete meaning alone by itself, we say it is an independent clause. Okay. Now, a dependent clause has a subject and a main verb, but it needs other pieces of language to have meaning. So if I write here, because I like cats, this is a dependent clause. It cannot live by itself. It needs more information to be a complete sentence. So I can say, I have 3 cats because I like cats. So this sentence actually has 2 clauses. This first clause, subject, main verb, this first clause is an independent clause. You can have this piece of information, I have 3 cats, alone. Like, it can live by itself. If I say to you, hey everybody, I have 3 cats, that has complete meaning. But it is together with this. And this is a dependent clause. It still has a subject and a main verb, but it cannot live without the independent clause. It needs an independent clause to have meaning. Dependent and independent clauses are the Lego pieces of the English language. Every sentence in an English language is a mix of dependent and independent clauses. So when you are writing your sentences, it's really useful to think about whether you're writing a dependent or independent clause. You will learn more about this in level 8, hopefully. Okay, so independent clauses have meaning by themselves. Dependent clauses need independent clauses to have complete meaning. So those 3 pieces of information, like what is an adjective, what is a clause, what is an independent and dependent clause, you need this information to understand how to put together an adjective clause. So I'm going to pause and change my board. If you need to review this before you watch the next section of the video, I recommend rewinding and watching again from the beginning. Okay, do I remember how to do this? Okay, I'm back. Okay, so there are 2 types of adjective or relative clauses. First, let's talk about this title. This form of sentence has 2 names. Some people call them adjective clauses, and I like that name better because I think it better describes what is happening. But some people call them relative clauses. You will hear both. So on your exam, they might ask you to identify some relative clauses or some adjective clauses. Please be prepared to understand that both of those things are the same thing. But I think I will call them adjective clauses because I think that's easier. Okay. So we have 2 types of adjective clauses, defining and undefining. So at first, I'm going to talk about defining. All right. So before we look at all of this, I want to look at this sentence. My brother, who lives in Toronto, called me yesterday. This sentence has 2 clauses inside of it. It has 1 independent clause and 1 dependent clause. If you don't understand what that means, please go back to the beginning of the video and watch it again. The thing that's a little bit complicated about adjective clauses is that the dependent clause is inside the independent clause, which sounds crazy, but let's talk about it. Okay. So, we're going to identify the independent clause. So this is the clause that could live by itself or be a complete unit of meaning. And that is, my brother called me yesterday. My brother called me yesterday is the independent clause. So if we removed this part of the sentence, my brother called me yesterday could be a complete sentence alone by itself with complete meaning. But our sentences in English are not so simple. Sometimes they are a little more complex. We have multiple clauses in one sentence. So here we have our dependent clause. And our dependent clause in the middle of our independent clause is who lives in Toronto. If you removed who lives in Toronto, that does not have complete meaning by itself. I can't say, hey everybody, who lives in Toronto? Actually, I can if it's a question. But it's not a question, it's a statement, and it has no meaning alone. So, English is so confusing. Okay, so I just want you to understand that we have two clauses. An independent clause, my brother called me yesterday, and a dependent clause, who lives in Toronto. All adjective clauses are dependent clauses. So your adjective clause is always a dependent clause. Adjective clauses are a style of dependent clause. So, are you with me so far? Okay. So let's take a look at this sentence, which is a mix of an independent clause and a dependent clause. And this dependent clause is called an adjective clause. Now, the reason it is called an adjective clause, because guess what? This whole clause works like an adjective in the sentence, in that it describes the noun. So, the noun in this sentence is my brother. And this whole clause is describing my brother. So this whole clause's job in the sentence is basically to be an adjective. So instead of saying the pink table, we could say something, the table, which is pink. And that is using an adjective clause to describe the table. Okay, so my brother is the subject. Who lives in Toronto is the adjective. And my brother called me yesterday is the independent clause. And who lives in Toronto is our dependent adjective clause. Whew. Okay. So, before we talk any more about adjective clauses, I just want to stop for a second and look at the grammar of these two clauses. Okay. My brother called me yesterday. So the thing that students actually have the most difficulty with is remembering that these two are actually one clause and they have to agree with each other. So my brother is the subject of this clause and called is the main verb. You have to make sure that the main verb agrees with the subject. That's the first thing. Also, you will notice that the main verb here is in the simple past, and the main verb of this clause, lives, is in the present simple. I want to tell you now that the verbs in each clause can be in different tenses. Depends on the situation. So my brother called me yesterday. We use the simple past because this is a finished action in the past. Here, we use the simple present, and the simple present because this is something that is generally true about my brother. He lives in Toronto. You will also notice that my brother, the verb lives, agrees with my brother too. My brother is basically the subject of both of these clauses. So these verbs can be in any tense, and they don't have to be in the same tense. They can be in the continuous, they can be in the past, they can be in the future, they can be in the present perfect, they can be in different ones. Each clause describes a different situation, but both verbs must agree with the subject they are describing. Okay, so let's talk about this, and specifically this. Okay, my brother, who lives in Toronto, called me yesterday. So what makes this adjective clause a defining adjective clause? So in this situation, I want you to imagine that I have 4 brothers. So if I say to you, without the adjective clause, if I say to you, hey, everybody, my brother called me yesterday, your question will be, which brother? Which brother? You have 4 brothers. My 4 brothers are a group of similar nouns. So I have 4 brothers. You don't know which brother I am talking about. So I need to add extra information to help separate my one brother from my group of brothers. So this is my brother who lives in Toronto. So if I say, my brother called me yesterday, and you say, which brother? I'll say, oh, the brother who lives in Toronto. So instead of waiting for you to ask that question, I'm going to add this defining information, the information that defines which brother I am talking about, into my sentence. So my brother, who lives in Toronto, called me yesterday. So this separates my one brother from my group of similar brothers. We use this all the time, more than you can imagine. So if I say, my student is excellent at writing, the person listening to me will say, Justine, you have 20 students. Which student are you talking about? So my students are a group of similar nouns. So I have to give some defining information. So I can say, my student who is from Colombia called me yesterday. No, that's wrong. I just looked at my own example. I can say, my student who is from Colombia, adjective clause, who is from Colombia is excellent at writing. And this defines which student I am talking about. So if you are using an adjective clause to separate your noun from a group of similar nouns, this is called a defining adjective clause. Okay. You will also notice that here and here, there are no commas. So when you use a defining relative clause, you do not use commas. However, what you can do is something to do with this, and we haven't talked about this word yet. So I'm going to put us on pause. I'm going to change this board, and we're going to talk about what this little word is doing in here. Okay. Hi. Okay. So in our sentence, my brother, who lives in Toronto, called me yesterday. So the word who has a very special name when it is inside an adjective clause. It is called a relative pronoun. So first let's talk about what a pronoun is. Pronouns are words we use to refer to nouns. So for example, my name is Justine, but my pronoun is she. So you can say, Justine is my teacher, she is amazing. But inside adjective clauses, we use special words as pronouns. So we use who when the subject is a person, and that makes sense. So in our sentence, my brother who lives in Toronto, we use who because my brother is a person. And so my brother is the subject of the independent clause, and who is the subject of the adjective clause. But they are the same thing. It's like saying, Justine, she is great at teaching. This is actually a mistake that lots of students make, especially my Arabic speakers. You often use the pronoun like it's a relative pronoun. So like, Justine, she is great at teaching. And that's a direct translation from your language. But we would, in English, actually just say, Justine, who is great at teaching, has pink hair. So we, instead of saying she in an adjective clause, we say who. Okay. Yes, honey bun? I'm making a video, honey. I love you. My daughter just came in. If you use, so we use who for people, but we use which for everything else. What are you doing? Okay. Yeah. Sorry, that's my ex-husband. Okay, so we use which for everything else. So any noun that is not a person, like if it is a thing, if it is a place, if it is a time, we use which. So instead of saying my brother who lives in Toronto, we can say London, like the city, London, which is a place. London, which is very boring, is where I was born. So we do not use where or when very often as a relative pronoun. We only use where or when in very specific situations, and we are not learning those situations today. So generally, you have two choices, who or which. And who is for people and which is for everything else. Now, if English was an easy language, you would be finished, but of course we are not. In defining relative pronouns, the one we just learned, when you use the adjective clause to separate a noun from a group of similar nouns, you can replace who or which with that. So, instead of saying, my brother who lives in Toronto called me yesterday, you can say, my brother that lives in Toronto called me yesterday. So often you hear people use that instead of who or which. So for example, London, which is really boring, is where I was born. I can say London, that is very boring, is where I was born. Okay. We also have whom or whose as possible relative pronouns. Whom we are going to talk about tomorrow. And whose is possessive. So I can say, my cat, whose name is Baby. My cat, whose name is Baby, is my favorite. And so the name Baby belongs to my cat. So we use whose. But I am not too worried. We'll talk about these tomorrow. So for right now, the three major relative pronouns are who, which, and that. Okay. So back to our defining and undefining relative pronouns. Come here. Speaking of Baby, are you going to come up? He's under the table right now. Come on, sweet baby. Okay. I'm not going to waste your time waiting for my cat. Okay, so let me just clear my board and we'll talk about undefining relative pronouns. Hi, we're back. Okay, so let's look at the second type of adjective clause, which is called an undefining adjective clause. So let's look at this example. Now, you're going to read this example, and you're going to be like, teacher, this is the exact same sentence. But this is talking about how context is very important. Because in this situation, I only have one brother. So I'm not separating one noun from a group of similar nouns. I am simply describing a unique noun. I only have one brother. So in this case, my one brother, lives in Toronto. So it's the same thing. This is the independent clause, and this is the dependent clause. And my brother called me yesterday. I can just say this, and this has meaning. That's totally fine. And you will probably know who I am talking about because you know I have a brother. So I don't have to add this information. In the first kind, in defining relative clauses, you have to add the information so the listener understands which noun you are talking about. But in this case, I don't have to add this information. I just want to add this information because it makes my sentence more interesting. And usually we're doing it to combine two very simple sentences. So in this case, the two sentences would be, my brother called me yesterday. And he lives in Toronto. So these two sentences are totally fine. Like, they're grammatically correct, just that they're a little simple and a bit boring and a bit low level. So if you are in level 4 or 5, you will probably use these two sentences. But we are in level 7 and we are about to go to level 8, so we want to make more complex sentences where we are combining information into one complex sentence. So, come here. So instead of using two sentences, we are going to combine the information into one more complex sentence. My brother, who lives in Toronto, called me yesterday. All right, so I just want to look here at this relative pronoun, who. So who is the relative pronoun for my brother? My brother is the subject of the independent clause, and who is the subject of the dependent or adjective clause. Look who is visiting. My cat, who is called Baby, is my favorite. This is my baby. So this is the example where you have one unique noun and you're just adding some extra information to describe that noun. That's really it. Okay. Let's do another example. Using oh my god, the cat's on the computer. Oh my god, crazy. Let's use a different example. Okay. Let's use an example where we have to use which. So let's say that my bicycle needs to be repaired. Okay. So my bicycle, which is actually my mom's, needs to be repaired. So what I want you to do right now is take a look at this sentence and can you identify the independent clause and the dependent adjective clause? So just take a second to be like, okay, where is the independent clause? Where is the dependent adjective clause? Okay. So, if you guessed that my bicycle needs to be repaired is the independent clause, you are correct. My bicycle is the subject of this clause, and needs is the main verb. Needs agrees with the subject. Okay. Now, I can say my bicycle needs to be repaired. I only have one bicycle. If I say my bicycle needs to be repaired, that is a totally functional sentence. However, I'm going to add some extra information because it's interesting. So if you guessed that which is actually my mom's is the adjective clause, you are correct. Okay, and then we have which. Which is a relative pronoun, and we use which because my bicycle is a thing. It is not a person. So I'm going to use which and not who. Now, if this was a defining relative pronoun, I could change this for that. But one of the rules of an undefining relative pronoun is you can't use that. You must use who or which or whom or whose. Okay. So in this case, which is the subject and is the main verb. In this case, both of the tenses are the same, but just because for the same reasons, like, this is something that's generally true. The bicycle is my mom's, and it needs to be repaired is also something that is generally true. And so I'm going to use the simple present for both. Okay. So this is defining and undefining relative clauses. One more thing about defining relative clauses is you will notice that there is a comma around on each side of the adjective clause. And I love this. I think it's easier for students to understand because the comma like separates the independent clause from the dependent clause. Now, the rule is you can use commas in undefining, but you can't use commas in defining adjective clauses. But I'm going to tell you a little secret. After your exam, like you need to know this rule for your exam, but after your exam, nobody understands or cares about this rule. Like even I just use commas all the time because I think it's grammatically easier to understand. So understand this rule for the test, but then after, just use commas everywhere. Don't tell anyone I'm telling you to break rules. Oh, don't do it in level 8, but when you later, even your professors at Fanshawe won't know this rule. Yeah. So, okay. So this is part 1 of adjective clauses. Tomorrow I'm going to do quite a long PowerPoint about part 2 of adjective clauses. So I'm sorry these videos are late today. They were long today. I had a lot of stuff to do, and I have even more marking to do tonight. So take a look at these videos, and please watch this video before you watch the second one. Okay, have a great day. Bye.